A very warm welcome to EPG Pathshala, and I'm Swati Banerjee, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And today I'll be talking to you on the module on feminist community practice within the paper on gender and social work. Feminist community practice is a slightly not used term, but community practice is a term which is used quite often. So we'll try to see what is this difference and how do we understand and what is its usefulness in practice and particularly in social work practice. So the topics that we'll discuss today would be trying to understand this difference between feminist practice and what would be the implication of working with women, which is something that we all do or social workers and development practitioners do. Implicit in this understanding of feminist community practice is the understanding of feminism. So we'll try and very briefly try to understand the very complex understanding of feminism. We'll also try to look at what are some of the key constructs that are defining all of this, which is about the understanding of power and empowerment of women, the whole process of collective power, collective action, and women's agency, and finally, the key principles of feminist community practice and their relevance in the field and their relevance in working with women, because that's what we all are aiming at, right? So, and from there we look at a way forward, and finally, how do we get a more in-depth understanding through references? So let's come to this very initial understanding as an introductory understanding as to how do we understand feminist community practice as difference from working with women or community practice with women. Today, most of the organizations, most of the NGOs are working with women. It could be around areas of water, it could be formation of self-help groups. A lot of government programs today are also largely targeting women. For example, the National Rural Livelihood Mission and a lot of these programs. Are all these practices that we do with women feminist practice, or is there a difference? So what is this difference? Feminist community practice emphasizes on recognizing, questioning, rejecting, and challenging the status quo that impacts women, or the status quo that women have in the society, and particularly focuses on women who are marginalized. Further, community practice with women or working with women usually often neglects or ignores such power relations, and their goals for community development are very different, where efforts, they might be working with women, but it need not necessarily be women-centric. It might be, the work with women might be simply to achieve certain social, political, or environmental goals. For example, a lot of work with self-help groups which are primarily with women, but the ultimate goal would be poverty alleviation. And often women are seen as people who will be able to return the credit or return the loan, and they will not use the money taken on loan or the credit taken on other things. They will use it on the family, not like men who might use it for drinking, and therefore the money is given to women, and self-help groups largely with women for our efficiency approach, the efficiency goal of development, and not to see whether gender hierarchies, women's position in society, women's position in the household are changed or altered. Therefore, community work with women is often non-feminist, and it rather strengthens the existing power structures. So it is imperative to see that we not just work with women and maintain the power hierarchies and maintain the status quo, but our effort would be to see through feminist practice how do we alter this power equations, or at least try and understand that our work with women is not simply feminist work, it's not simply changing power equations, it's much more than that. So, as we said, within feminist community practice, the implicit thought that is ingrained into it is the theory, idea, or strand of feminism. Feminism has been understood differently by different thoughts and different discourses in feminism, and there are several meanings. But one common goal, which is to challenge the social status quo that subjugates women and to change the oppression that women are facing. One of the most radical elements of feminist practice framework is that unequal power relations must be challenged, and adhering to social norms will never empower women. Feminism therefore criticizes the very ideology where men are considered better than women, and thus gives explanation for the gender inequalities that exist in the societies. Women have multiple identities, but their identity of being a woman connects them across other women, and often they're victims of unequal power relationships in different ways. So, to sum it up, the key tenets of feminism, therefore, would be to understand that women are oppressed because of their identity of being a woman, and then there are several identities which we also need to look at as they intersect and create certain experiences. Simultaneously, different strands of feminist thought also gives an understanding about the causes and effects of this oppression of women, and finally, it also tries and suggests a way forward. And based on this understanding, there are different strands in feminist thought. Therefore, the key feminist slogan is "Personal is Political," which re-emphasizes the relevance of women's personal experiences to understand the politics in women's lives. Feminism, therefore, in a very broad sense, means to recognize that women have always been denied equal rights due to the gender inequities which are very deeply ingrained in our social structures. And it is extremely important to see these gendered constructions of social problems existing in various communities, and we need to move towards a process of change and transformation, and feminist community practice is one perspective and a strategy to move towards this process of change and transformation by challenging the status quo, by challenging the existing power hierarchies that exist in our society. Given this large understanding of feminist community practice, feminism that influences feminist community practice, what are some of the key constructs that influences these thoughts? Power and empowerment of women is a very important understanding that influences feminist community practice. However, women empowerment today has almost lost its meaning. It has become a jargon due to its overuse of the term. It's an attractive idea. And often, if you're writing project proposals, which you would do, you will realize that you need to use the term empowerment somewhere for it to get funded. Now, how do we move beyond this jargon to understand what are the complexities, how do we unpack, and how do we understand its relevance to change women's lives? Empowerment can be conceptualized as a change in unequal power relations in the favor of the oppressed. So, the centrality of the marginalized women, the centrality of the oppressed women is intrinsic to the idea of empowerment. Roland writes about 4 types of power, which explains how do we understand power and therefore how do we transform it for empowerment. She talks about power over. Power over is about absolute power, absolute domination of one group over the other. For example, it could be certain caste groups having absolute power over another set of groups belonging to a particular community or caste. It could also be, for example, let's say, if I am a teacher and you are the students, and because of the fact that I evaluate you, I would have absolute power over you. Now, the next would be power 2. It's about having power, but that power is used more constructively for positive change. For example, let's say parents have power over children, but they don't necessarily use that power to punish children. They would use it constructively for the growth of children. Power width. That is very important when we are talking about marginalized women and when we are talking about feminist community practice. It's about collective power, that the group of oppressed individuals, when they come together, they have power with or collective power to resist domination. So power with helps us to resist the status quo, resist the unequal power relations. So most movements are wonderful examples of creative power which resist the dominant hegemony, the dominant structures, and tries to bring about newer relationships which talks about collective and shared forms of power. Finally, power within. And that is very important when we are talking about women. Essentially because women have been, and many women have been, historically oppressed, and therefore there is an understanding of negative idea about themselves and a lesser self-worth. So power within helps in increasing one's critical consciousness that leads to the feeling of self-esteem and self-worth. And at the same time, we feel, or women feel, that we need to be respected. Others can't disrespect us. A lot of times in our work with marginalized women, we realize when we are collectivizing them, let's say we are working on the water issue and we have to go and meet some government authorities. And a lot of times women would say, "Tai or sister, you go and talk with the government officials. We can't go, we can't talk with them. We have never talked." Now this feeling of we can't do needs to be translated through critical consciousness, and power within plays a very critical role here. Feminist community practice gives immense importance to collective power and collective action. It believes that women together can exert more power on the oppressed, and this power width can challenge the existing power hierarchy. When we are talking about collective power, when we are talking about shared power, shared understanding of one's realities, that leads us to action, that leads us to collective action. Power gets built when women come together. And how does that happen? It happens through several ways. And believe me, there is no framework to say that it can happen this way or that way. But from our experiences and from the available literature, we cull out some of the important indicators that can lead to collectivization, and we can try to replicate the same in our work and in our understanding. So the key starting point would be identification of needs of women which are central to their lives. It need not be top down. For example, a lot of time, and it has even happened with me in my work with women, we would say that we feel as urban women often going to rural areas, when we don't see a toilet, we feel toilets are the most important thing that needs to be done. And it happened with one of these groups, and the social worker went around and went to every woman's house, said that, "Do you need a toilet?" And they couldn't say no, so they told yes. And when they all came for the community meeting, and when again the social worker asked them, "Do you need a toilet?" Each woman said, no, I don't need, but maybe you ask my neighbor, maybe you ask the other woman. And the social worker went around and realized that none of the women there needs a toilet. She probed further and realized that water is the main issue for them. Availability of work is the main issue for them. So how do we identify needs which are central to the lives and contextual to the realities of the women there? Once we have done that, once we have identified the problems, and it is a shared problem of the group, we try and prioritize what needs to be done immediately and what can be done a little later. For example, in one of our training programs with women on agricultural implements or appropriate agricultural technology, we realized that though women had expressed the need for that, they were not coming. And then we realized that women did not have a place to keep their children. There was no Anganwadi in that village. So their first priority was to have an Anganwadi where they can keep their children, then they can come for this training programs. And therefore we had to rework our priority in terms of the process of implementation. Once we have done that, the next important thing is to see how do we develop confidence amongst women to work on their needs. Like I said, most often women who are historically marginalized would feel, no, I can't do that. You do it for me. How do we work with that power within to raise women's critical consciousness? Once we have done that as well, it is also important to look at resources, both human, material and financial resources to be able to deal with that issue, and it calls for a lot of collaboration, networking, etc. And finally, it's about collective action. It's about coming together and trying to solve that problem. More often we see that this process of collectivization often works when it is an immediate practical need. For example, water not there, women coming together, negotiating with government officials, trying to see if we can form a well. But it does not happen, for example, with larger strategic needs which are more structurally embedded. For example, violence against women. It's not easy to work on violence against women. You go to a village and suddenly you start talking about violence against women, you will not be allowed to work there. So it's important to understand how do we understand the contextual realities, and therefore how do we prioritize. But collective action has great potential to bring change. And one of the important implicit understanding when we are talking about collective action, it's about agency. That is women's potential to fight against injustice, to question the structural inequalities, and to transform their lives into a more dignified life. And building, when women come together, it's about individually they might not have that agency, but collective agency really works in feminist community practice. Now I'll take you through an example of this process of collectivization for us to grasp a little bit of how it happens in reality, and then you can perhaps reflect back to your work that you are doing or you may be doing. This is an example of one village in Maharashtra where a non-governmental organization was working with a group of women trying to collectivize them into self-help groups. They started, like many other organizations, with a practical need of poverty alleviation and livelihood generation. So they started with income generation program. But what happened there was that they actually gave a space for women to come together and discuss their problems. So they started talking about there is not enough food to give their children, how their husbands often drink, how they beat. So they started talking about themselves, and that led to formation of collective relationships. Which then led to a very important event in the life of the women. The women in this particular village were never allowed to hoist the national flag, essentially because they are women. So the women all these years wouldn't have thought that it is a problem for them, but now that there is a critical consciousness, or there was a critical consciousness amongst them, they thought that it is a problem and they need to do something about it. And along with the help of the NGO, they decided that they will field a candidate from their self-help group for the election. Now, there are many processes in it. It's not as easy as I'm saying it here, but the woman was fielded as a candidate, and finally she won. And a very interesting thing, the election campaign they did was, their election symbol was a bucket. So they would usually, try to collectivize women by saying, all my sisters, try and come and vote for us, vote for this bucket. Finally, the women was elected. She was able to hoist the national flag, and that was one step towards a process of empowerment. But when I'm saying this, it is not to say that the process of empowerment is very linear. There are many complexities, and even this particular woman, which I learned a little later, when I was working with her and when I was doing this study with her, after I finished and I was coming back from that village, by that time I had built a little rapport with this woman. I was coming back and suddenly she broke down. She cried. And I said, why are you crying? And she said, sister, you might have, you have seen or you have understood it as a wonderful story of empowerment, but there is much more to it, which I could not share with you earlier. And then she told me her story, her narrative, that when she became the head of the village, or the sarpanch, and one day when she was going from the field, the ex-sarpanch threatened to rape her if she doesn't relinquish her position. And she again started crying, and she told me, sister, as a woman you understand how difficult it is to deal with this threat. And she said, I felt I would leave my position, but there were other women and slowly other men in the village who supported me, and I could continue. So therefore we understand that empowerment is a journey, but collectivization really helps in this journey or in this process. Principles of feminist community practice. What are the key principles? There are many key principles which helps in strategizing in our work with women and to help improve their status. Some of the key principles would be recognizing and addressing women-specific issues, sisterhood, emotion as a critical strength, group development, women's capacity building, cooperative and collective participatory decision making, which we also call as flattened hierarchies, reclaiming women's spaces, celebrating women's history and their traditions, celebrating women's act of courage, and recognizing cultural diversity and the differences that exist among women. Now let's take this one by one and see what are some of the key tenets within it. Recognizing and addressing women's specific issues. This is an important principle in feminist community practice. There are always certain issues that impact only women, and it is extremely important to recognize and analyze such gender-specific issues. For example, in one of the tribal communities I recently visited, the Rathwa community in Gujarat, sickle cell anemia amongst women was a major concern. There are other issues like, for example, water problem. Some of these problems never get raised. Most often in community meetings, the men would be very vocal, the women would be silent, and therefore a lot of so-called women's issues, women's experiences gets invisibilized. The gender division of labor can bring out some of the women-specific issues very clearly. For example, women will never engage in anything if their work burden and their responsibilities of taking care of children, etc. are not met. So it's important, for example, often we go to villages or go to other areas and call for meetings, and some of these meetings is when women are to collect water, and then women are not there in these meetings. So how do we understand some of these priorities, some of these issues that are there with women before we actually strategize and work with them? Feminist literature says that availability of time is the biggest challenge that one faces while working with women, and it's important to see how do we unburden women to be able to involve them in our mobilization work. Strategic needs, it's very important when we, like we said, when we work with women, to understand what are the immediate needs and what are largely deeply entrained structural needs, and how do we work towards a combination of both practical and strategic needs. Now we come to the second principle in feminist community practice, which is about sisterhood. Where it's very interesting. Here we talk about emotion as a critical strength. Often emotion is overlooked as something which is not good, but in feminism, in feminist community practice, in collective action, we say that it's very important to connect with each other, to share our stories, to share our difficulties, to share our understanding, to be able to come together to take action. Feminist community practice emphasizes that women organize. When women organize, it is much more than just helping each other. It leads to an exchange of empowerment. Again, to give you, a small example, in one of the community meetings in a slum in Mumbai, we were talking about largely credit issues. And then while doing that, one woman just broke down and she started crying. And then I didn't realize what was happening. Then the other woman said, last night she was beaten very badly by her husband. And then they started talking about it. They said, but it's not something which is, it's very strange, because all of us get beaten at some point or the other. And there's nothing to talk about it. Slowly, when all of them started talking, they realized that there's a need to talk about it. There's a need to be with each other, connect with each other, bond with each other, so that they are able to overthrow some of these oppressive structures. And then they realize that it's important for them to support each other. And there are many examples where when one woman, when her husband is beating, or when her husband is about to beat, the other woman come together and resist it. And in the front of collective action, with so many women being there, the men get very scared. So there are various examples to say that emotion is a very critical strength which we need to draw on in feminist practice. Group development. It's also very important for transformation that we work in groups. Groups are known to be building blocks of many change interventions, and groups with a purpose, group with a sense of direction. It's very important to facilitate and monitor the group for also strategic capacity building. So it's not enough to just ensure that women are collectivized in different groups, but it's very important to see how do we facilitate women's participation in these groups by capacity building and trying to understand what are the issues and trying to address them together. And today we see that most of the government programs are trying to form self-help groups, are trying to form collectives, are trying to form federations at various levels, and collectivizing women into groups, or what they also call community-based institutions, so as to often rework the existing power structure, or what we say that groups or institutions or community-based institutions can rework or deinstitutionalize some of the existing institutions like patriarchy or caste system. And this creates a huge scope for conscientization and a process of change. Cooperative, collective, and participatory decision making or flattened hierarchies. We need to create an ecosystem where women are able to talk to each other without any fear, and there is a scope to participate. And there are things like, we institute things like rotational leadership, collective decision making, division of labor, etc., etc. A lot of these participatory mechanisms often lead to grassroots innovations. And when we are talking about participatory decision making and also creating a pedagogy to capture those decision making which is participatory in nature and not just from the lens of an outsider or researcher, it often leads to very, very interesting revelations. Again, a quick example from the field. We were doing this understanding of skill gap analysis with women in a village in Marathwada in Maharashtra. And this group of women, they were talking about Gotri, and they said yes, they have skill of knowledge and skill of Gotri, and in future also they want to do an enterprise with it. One of the women's little daughter was sitting there. To understand the aspirations a little more from her point of view, we were trying to use this participatory pedagogy, and I asked her, do you also want your daughter to get into Gotri? Her immediate response was, of course not. She will study and be a teacher like you. And all of us, for all of us, that was a very interesting revelation, because that is what is the real aspiration, and often aspiration gets constrained in several realities. So how do we understand that? And creating this participatory environment often helps us to understand those realities, those aspirations of people, and then trying to address it. Reclaiming women's spaces. Feminist practice also emphasizes how do we look at different spaces and women's participation in different spaces. For example, often when we see a gram panchayat in a village or the panchayat structure, often we see the participation of the women is very less. And most of the villages in India, we have this concept of pati sarpanch, or the husband acting as the sarpanch or as the proxy sarpanch. So most often, there are spaces which are considered to be exclusively for men, and women don't get to participate in that. Market is another space where women are mostly prohibited. However, we know that market is such a critical role, in the development of or the control of economy, and we need to see how women are able to participate in these various spaces. Celebrating women's history and traditions. Women undoubtedly have certain traditions, songs, history, identity, and women relate to each other through these activities. So it's important to recognize their work, value their work, so that women don't feel we don't do anything. Women and others also should not feel that they don't do anything. We need to understand, recognize, and add value, not just let them or let us stay where we are, but create newer skills and celebrate the womanhood. Celebrating women's act of courage. Patriarchal systems work in such a way that women themselves often perpetuate it without knowing about it. The notions of good woman, the notion of bad woman, sometimes are so entrenched in our thought process that we fail to appreciate acts of courage, we fail to appreciate acts of resistance. Such acts, which are a response to violence, women pursuing her dreams, etc., needs to be recognized, again, needs to be highlighted. And this helps us to fight against subjugation, fight against structural hierarchies. Recognizing cultural diversities among women, and finally, like we always have said, there is a sameness amongst women and there is differences amongst women, and we need to celebrate this diversity. And feminists are committed to end, all types of inequities, including violence, and strengthen women's status by bridging bridges across different kinds of women. So identity perspective plays an important indicator to also understand these differences that are existing. And the feminist, finally, all these feminist principles or principles of feminist community practice stresses that women need to respect themselves, women need to respect each other, and create this shared sense of identity and a collective, and move towards a pathway which is challenging, which is changing the hierarchies. So to sum up this discussion and to conclude it, how do we reduce this gender gap that exists through one of the strategy and perspective, which is feminist community practice and social work? Summing up, feminism is often a misunderstood term. You ask a lot of people, they will say, we want to work with women, we are sensitive, but we are not feminist. Feminist is often considered as a very elitist thought by many men and women, which often leads to gender blind work. So it's important to understand, reclaim some of these thought processes and understand its relevance in anti-oppressive work and in gendered work. Feminist principle stresses that women are the experts of their lives. Nobody from outside needs to tell them what needs to be done. This stems from the most famous slogan again, which we have discussed, personal is political, that conveys that what women experience personally is also part of a larger societal reality and therefore can be analyzed politically. Feminist practice, therefore, also tries to bridge the gap between the constitutional rights and the social norms and values that are there by collectivizing women and trying to see its relevance. Feminist practice, therefore, also helps the social worker or the development practitioner to analyze the nature of intervention and look at a way forward so that they are able to look at things like gender division of labor, access and control over resources, etc. And present-day developmental professionals have lots to learn from this kind of feminist practice, which has a very sharp gendered lens. I mean, the word feminist itself talks about it, where feminist practices or feminist perspectives are well embedded in the strategies that are implemented in the field, so that we don't continue to do gender blind work by involving women or by not involving women, and we very consciously try to work towards a transformative pathway. And I'm sure all of you would be interested to know a little more about it, and there are many interesting readings, and one of this would be Feminist Community Practice, the Handbook of Feminist Community Practice. You can also look at Rowland's and her idea of empowerment. Finally, I end this discussion by again quoting something which says, change can take place only when women raise their voice collectively. A very, very important quote which I feel is really important in collective work, and it also helps us to examine some of our inherent mainstream understanding, and therefore we should always be questioning. And in the end, I want to leave you with a set of questions, and when you work, try to question this. Some of the questions I want to leave you with in your work would be: examine who participates, what institutions are involved, what objectives local participation has, how do we understand the politics of participation, exclusion and inclusion of women in it, and ultimately what changes and who benefits and at what cost, who is empowered and who is disempowered. Thank you so much.